The town of Red Valley looked peaceful from a distance. White houses stood beside dusty roads. Horses waited in front of the saloon. Merchants opened their shops before sunrise. But behind the clean windows and polite smiles, the town belonged to one man. Edward Blackwood. He owned the largest ranch. He owned the bank. He owned half the stores, and most people feared him more than they respected him. For a long time, Grace Whitmore believed she was different. She believed Edward loved her. She believed his promises. He had spoken to her gently after her father died. He had helped her keep the small house her family left behind. He had told her she was safe with him. Then one rainy evening she discovered the truth. Edward had never wanted her heart. He wanted her land. Her father's old property stood beside a hidden water spring. A spring. Edward needed to expand his ranch. When Grace refused to sell, he pretended to love her. He made promises. He spoke of marriage. He made the whole town believe she would become his wife. But Grace found the papers in his office. Documents with her name forged. Planned to take her home after the wedding, and a letter written to one of his men. Once she becomes my wife, the land is mine. Grace read those words again and again. Her hands trembled. Her heart broke in silence. She did not cry, not at first. She only felt cold. The man she trusted had turned her grief into a trap. That night she ran. She took only a small bag, her father's old necklace, and the horse that had belonged to her mother. Rain fell hard over the valley. Thunder rolled above the hills. Grace rode without looking back. She knew Edward would come after her. A man like him did not accept being exposed. A man like him did not let anyone escape. The storm grew worse. The road disappeared beneath mud and water. Grace tried to guide the horse toward the mountains, but the animal slipped. Near a rocky slope, she fell hard. Pain shot through her side. Her head struck the ground. For a moment the world spun around her. She tried to stand. She could not. The rain soaked her dress. The cold entered her bones. She whispered a prayer. Then darkness took her. Far above the valley, a man stood beneath the storm. His name was Ahote. He was an Apache warrior. Once, many people had known his name. They spoke of his courage, his strength, his honor. But for years he had lived alone in the mountains. He avoided towns. He avoided strangers. He avoided every road that could lead him back to pain. Long ago he had lost his family during a violent raid. After that night, he stopped believing in peace. He stopped believing in love. He built a small cabin high among the pines and became a shadow among the cliffs. Some people in Red Valley called him a ghost. Others said he was dangerous. None of them knew the truth. He was only a man who had lost too much. That night, Ahote was returning from the ridge when he saw something near the lower path. A horse stood alone in the rain. Nervous, frightened. Ahote moved closer. Then he saw the woman lying near the rocks. He knelt beside her. She was breathing. Barely. There was blood near her temple. Her arm was bruised. Her body shook from the cold. Ahote looked toward the valley. No one was coming. If he left her there, she would die before morning. For a moment, he hesitated. Helping her meant bringing another life into his silence. It meant opening a door he had kept closed for years. Then Grace moved slightly and whispered something he could not understand. Her face carried the look of someone who had been betrayed by the world. Ahote knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection. He lifted her carefully. Then he placed her on his horse and led the animal through the storm. The path to his cabin was dangerous. The rain made the stones slippery. The wind pushed against him like a warning. But Ahote did not stop. By the time he reached the cabin, the fire had almost died. He carried Grace inside. He laid her near the hearth. He covered her with warm blankets. Then he cleaned the wound on her forehead. with water and healing herbs. For hours he stayed, awake beside the fire. The storm continued outside. The woman slept uneasily. Sometimes she trembled. Sometimes she whispered the name Edward, with fear in her voice. Ahaut listened, and with every broken whisper, he understood more. This woman was not running from the storm. She was running from a man. Near dawn, Grace opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was firelight. The second was the face of a stranger. A strong man with long dark hair sat near the door. His eyes were calm, but full of old sorrow. Grace tried to move. Pain stopped her. "Where am I?" she asked weakly. Safe. The man answered. Grace looked around the cabin. "Who are you?" Ahaut. She tried to sit up again. "I have to go. He will find me." Ahaut did not move. "Who will find you?" Grace closed her eyes. "A man everyone thinks is honorable. A man who destroys anything he cannot own." Ahaut watched her carefully. Outside, the first light of morning touched the mountains. Inside the cabin, two wounded souls sat on opposite sides of the fire. One had been betrayed by love. The other had buried love long ago. Neither of them knew that destiny had brought them together for a reason. And neither of them knew that Edward Blackwood had already sent men into the storm to find her. Grace spent the next several days inside the cabin. The injury on her head slowly healed. The pain in her side became easier to bear. But the wound in her heart remained unchanged. Ahaut rarely asked questions. Each morning he left before sunrise. He returned with water, firewood, or food gathered from the mountains. His life followed the same quiet rhythm every day. At first, Grace found the silence uncomfortable. Then she began to appreciate it. For the first time since discovering Edward's betrayal, nobody was trying to tell her what to do. Nobody was judging her. Nobody was asking her to explain herself. One afternoon, she stepped outside the cabin. The mountains stretched endlessly before her. Tall pines covered the slopes. A clear river sparkled below. The beauty of the place seemed unreal. Ahaut was repairing part of the roof when he noticed her, standing there. "You should still be resting," he said. Grace looked at him. "You hardly ever rest, eh?" Faint smile appeared on his face. "That is different." Grace realized it was probably the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him. The discovery surprised her. Later that day, they sat near the fire. The cabin was quiet, except for the sound of burning wood. Finally, Grace spoke. "Why do you live alone?" Ahaut stared into the flames. "Because it is easier." "Easier than what?" He remained silent for a moment. "Easier than losing someone again." Grace lowered her eyes. For the first time, she understood that the sadness she had seen in him was not loneliness. It was grief. The same grief she carried inside herself. That night she told him part of her story. Not everything. Only enough. She spoke about Edward, his promises, his lies, his plan to steal her father's land. Ahaut listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "There are men who believe everything can be owned." Grace looked toward the fire. "Edward is one of them." The next morning Ahaut rode down toward a trading post, hidden between two valleys. He needed supplies. While he was there, he overheard a conversation that immediately caught his attention. Edward Blackwood had offered a reward. A large reward for information about a woman named Grace Whitmore. Several men were already searching the mountains. Ahaut returned to the cabin. Before sunset, his expression was darker than usual. Grace noticed immediately. Something happened, she said. Ahaut sat beside the fire. "Edward is looking for you." Grace felt the blood leave her face. "How many men?" "Enough." He answered. Fear returned instantly. The fear she had almost forgotten during the peaceful days in the mountains. Edward had more money than anyone in Red Valley. Money could buy loyalty. Money could buy hunters. Money could buy trouble. "I Should leave. Grace said quietly. Ahote looked at her. Why? Because if I stay here, I bring danger to you. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Ahote stood and walked toward the door. Grace thought he was angry. Instead, he pointed toward the mountains. Outside, those peaks have survived storms for thousands of years. They do not run every time the wind changes. Grace looked at him. Neither should you. The words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. For the first time since arriving, someone had chosen to stand beside her instead of abandoning her. Far below the mountains, Edward Blackwood sat inside his office. One of his men had just delivered important news. A trapper had spotted smoke near an isolated cabin high in the mountains. Edward smiled slowly. At last, he said, prepare the horses. His men exchanged nervous glances. They knew that smile. It was the smile Edward wore when he intended to get exactly what he wanted. And this time what he wanted was Grace. No matter who stood in his way. The search for Grace intensified. Every trail leading into the mountains was being watched. Edward Blackwood had money. And money made people brave when they should have been careful. One afternoon, Grace was helping Ahote gather firewood near a stream. The weather was warm. Birds sang among the trees. For a short time, she almost forgot the danger waiting beyond the mountains. They stopped beside the water. Grace watched the current move around smooth stones. This place feels different from the rest of the world, she said. Ahote nodded. That is why I stayed. Grace looked at him. For years? For years. A faint smile touched her lips. You must really dislike people. For the first time, she heard him laugh softly. Not all people. The answer surprised both of them. The silence that followed felt different. Warmer. More personal. That evening they returned to the cabin carrying bundles of wood. Neither noticed the man hidden among the trees. One of Edward's trackers had finally found them. He watched from a distance, then quietly rode back toward Red Valley. By nightfall, Edward received the news. A cabin near Eagle Ridge. An Apache warrior, and a woman matching Grace's description. Edward smiled. Tomorrow we ride. Back in the mountains, Grace woke during the night. A nightmare had returned. She saw Edward standing in her father's house, signing papers, taking everything. She sat up, breathing hard. The cabin was dark, except for the dying fire. Ahote was awake. He sat near the doorway, watching the stars. Bad dream? He asked. Grace nodded. Sometimes I think he took more than my land, she said. What else? My ability to trust people. Ahote stared into the darkness. I understand that. Grace looked at him. More than you know, he replied. For a moment, she wanted to ask about his past, about the family he had lost. About the pain hidden behind his calm eyes. But she did not. Some wounds needed time. The next morning, Ahote discovered fresh tracks near the river. His expression changed immediately. Grace saw it. Someone found us, didn't they? Ahote studied the ground. Yes. How long do we have? Not long. Far below the mountain, Edward and 6 armed men were already riding toward Eagle Ridge. And for the first time since Grace arrived, danger was no longer distant. It was coming straight for them. Ahote wasted no time. The fresh tracks told him everything he needed to know. Edward's men were close. Very close. Grace watched him prepare supplies inside the cabin. His movements were calm, precise, but she could see the tension in his eyes. We should leave, she said. Ahote nodded. We leave before sunset. For the next few hours, they packed only what they truly needed. Food, water, blankets, nothing more. When the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, they started moving deeper into the wilderness. The trail became narrow. Steep cliffs surrounded them. Only someone who knew the mountains well could travel there safely. Grace followed as best she could. Several times, Ahote offered his hand when the path became dangerous. Each time she accepted. And each time she felt a little safer. Meanwhile, Edward and his men reached the cabin. The place was empty. One of the men cursed. Another kicked over a chair. Edward remained silent. Then he noticed the fire pit. The ashes were still warm. They had left recently. A cold smile appeared on his face. Good. That means they are tired. And tired people make mistakes. Back in the mountains, darkness fell quickly. Ahote led Grace toward a hidden cave. Overlooking a valley. Very few people knew it existed. They built a small fire near the entrance. For the first time that day, they stopped moving. Grace sat quietly watching the flames. After a long silence, she spoke. "Why are you helping me?" Ahote looked at the fire. "Because someone should have helped you sooner." The answer touched her deeply. Most people in Red Valley had looked away when Edward used his power. Nobody had stood beside her. Nobody except this man. A man who had every reason to avoid trouble. Yet he stayed. That night, a storm rolled across the mountains. Thunder echoed through the valley. Rain hammered the rocks outside the cave. Grace could not sleep. Neither could Ahote. They sat together near the fire, listening to the storm. Eventually Grace looked at him. "Were you always alone?" "No." He answered quietly. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Ahote continued. "I had a wife and a son." Grace lowered her eyes. The pain in his voice was impossible to miss. "What happened?" "A raid. Many years ago. I could not save them." The words were simple, but the grief behind them was enormous. Grace understood immediately. For the first time she saw the full truth. The strongest man she had ever met carried wounds as deep as her own. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his. "You did not deserve that." She whispered. "Neither did you." He replied. Their eyes met. Something changed in that moment. Neither spoke about it. Neither needed to. Far below the mountains, Edward's men continued searching through the rain. One of them finally discovered something. Fresh horse tracks leading toward the northern cliffs. Edward smiled. They were getting closer. Much closer. And by the next day he planned to corner them where there would be nowhere left to run. Neither Grace nor Ahote knew it yet, but the most dangerous part of their journey was about to begin. The next morning the storm was gone. The mountains looked calm again. But Ahote knew appearances could be deceiving. Edward and his men were still searching, and sooner or later they would find the northern cliffs. Grace and Ahote left the cave shortly after sunrise. The path ahead led through a narrow canyon surrounded by towering stone walls. Few people knew the route existed. That was exactly why Ahote chose it. As they walked, Grace noticed something different. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt natural. Comforting. For the first time in many years, she trusted someone completely. Near midday, they stopped beside a small waterfall. The clear water rushed down the rocks into a pool below. Grace sat near the edge and smiled. "This place is beautiful," she said. Ahote sat beside her. "My wife loved this place." The words came unexpectedly. He rarely spoke about his past. Grace turned toward him. What was she like? A small smile appeared on his face. She laughed often. She believed every storm eventually ended. Grace listened carefully. "And your son?" Ahote looked toward the water. He wanted to become a warrior. He thought he was already one. For the first time Grace heard warmth in his voice when he spoke about them. Only pain. Love. The memory clearly still lived inside him. After a long silence, Grace spoke softly. "They would be proud of you." Ahote looked at her. For a moment, neither looked away. Something deeper was growing between them, something neither could deny any longer. Far below the canyon, Edward's men finally discovered the trail. One of the trackers pointed toward the cliffs. They went this way. Edward smiled. Good. Keep moving. By late afternoon, the hunters were only a few hours behind. Back in the canyon, Grace slipped. While crossing a rocky ledge, she lost her balance. Before she could fall, Ahote caught her arm. For a moment, she stood pressed against him. Their eyes met. The world seemed to disappear around them. Then Grace smiled softly. You keep saving me. Ahote's expression softened. Maybe. Destiny keeps giving me reasons to. Grace felt her heart race. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Then distant voices echoed through the canyon. Edward's men. The moment was broken. Ahote immediately became alert. They found the trail. He said, How close are they? Too close. Without wasting another second, they continued deeper into the mountains. But Edward was no longer simply searching. He was hunting. And before sunset, he planned to trap them inside a valley with only one way out. A place where he believed even the great Apache warrior could not escape. What Edward did not know was that Ahote had survived far worse than any trap a wealthy rancher could create. And this time he was fighting for someone he was no longer willing to lose. The canyon narrowed as the sun began to sink. Behind the mountains, Ahote moved quickly. He knew the land better than anyone, but he also knew Edward's men were closing the distance. By late afternoon, they reached a hidden valley surrounded by cliffs. A river crossed the center. Tall pine trees covered the slopes. To most people, it looked like a dead end. To Ahote, it was a refuge. They stopped beside the river to rest. Grace watched him study the surrounding cliffs. You have been here before. She said. Many times. Ahote answered. When? I wanted to disappear from the world. Grace looked around. And now? Now I do not want to disappear anymore. The word surprised even him. Grace smiled softly. For the first time, she saw hope replacing the sadness in his eyes. At that moment, a distant sound echoed through the valley. Horse hooves? Ahote immediately stood. They found us. He said. Grace felt fear return. What do we do? We keep moving. They crossed the river and climbed toward a narrow passage hidden between two cliffs. But Edward had planned carefully. As they reached the upper trail, several riders appeared ahead. Others emerged behind them. The trap had closed. Edward rode forward with a satisfied smile. You have nowhere left to run, he called out. Grace stared at him. The same man who once promised her love now looked at her as if she were property. Come back with me, Edward said. And all of this ends. Grace shook her head. Never. Edward's expression darkened. Then I will make this difficult. The men around him began moving forward. Ahote stepped in front of Grace. His eyes never left. Edward. Leave. He said calmly. Several riders laughed. Edward did not. He knew enough about Ahote to be cautious. For a long moment nobody moved. Then one of Edward's men urged his horse forward. The horse suddenly slipped on loose rocks and nearly threw its rider. Ahote had chosen this place for a reason. The terrain favored someone who understood the mountains, not a group of ranch hands. Within minutes, confusion spread among Edward's men. Several horses became frightened. Others struggled to move through the narrow path. Edward's perfect trap began falling apart. Grace watched in amazement. Ahote was not fighting with anger. He was fighting with patience and intelligence. Eventually, Edward ordered his men to pull back. The cliffs were too dangerous. The light was fading. But before leaving, Edward pointed at Grace. This is not over, he shouted. Then he turned his horse and disappeared into the valley. That night, Ahote and Grace sheltered inside a hidden cave overlooking the river. The danger had passed for now, but both knew Edward would return. As darkness settled around them, Grace sat beside the fire. She looked at Ahote. Why do you keep risking everything for me? Ahote stared into the flames. Because some things are worth fighting for. Grace felt her heart race. Neither looked away. Slowly, Ahote reached for her hand. For a moment the world became silent. And he gently kissed her. It was not rushed. It was not driven by passion alone. It was the kiss of two wounded hearts, finally allowing themselves to feel again. When they separated, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Far below the mountain, Edward sat beside his campfire, consumed by rage. He had failed again, and that failure was becoming unbearable. For the first time, he stopped thinking about Grace's land. Now he wanted revenge, and revenge would make him far more dangerous than before. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. Grace and Ahote remained, hidden among the mountains. Far away from Red Valley. Far away from Edward. For the first time, neither of them felt completely alone. They spent long hours walking beside rivers and forest trails. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply enjoyed the silence. One evening they sat together on a ridge, overlooking the valley. The sky glowed orange and gold as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Grace smiled. "I used to dream about a life like this," she said. "What happened?" Ahote asked. "I believed the wrong man." Her answer carried no anger, only sadness. Ahote nodded slowly. "I spent years blaming myself for things I could not change." Grace looked at him. "And now?" "Now I am tired of living in the past." Their eyes met. For the first time, both allowed themselves to imagine a future. A future together. Meanwhile, Edward Blackwood was becoming more desperate. Each failure made him more dangerous. Each humiliation made his anger grow. The people of Red Valley had begun whispering. Many already knew what he had done to Grace. Others were questioning his methods. His reputation was beginning to crack, and Edward could not accept that. One evening he gathered the few loyal men he still trusted. "I know how to force them out," he said. His men listened carefully. Edward spread a map across the table. "There is an old trading cabin in the northern forest. They sometimes pass near it. We will use it." The next morning his men put the plan into motion. Several hours later, Ahote discovered something strange. Smoke, rising from the direction of the old trading cabin. Someone was there. He frowned. Very few people knew about that place. Grace noticed his expression. "What is it? What is it?" "Someone is in the forest." Ahote replied. They decided to investigate carefully. As they approached, they found a wounded traveler outside the cabin. The man appeared exhausted. His leg was injured. He claimed bandits had attacked him. Grace immediately wanted to help. Ahote remained cautious. Something felt wrong. Still, they could not leave an injured man alone. They brought him water and food. For several hours, everything seemed normal. Then Ahote noticed something. The man's boots. They were expensive. Far too expensive for an ordinary traveler. And hidden beneath his coat was a silver badge used by Edward's ranch hands. The realization came instantly. The injured traveler was bait. A trap. At that exact moment, several riders appeared. Among the trees, Edward's men. The wounded traveler jumped to his feet. His injury had been fake all along. Grace's eyes widened. Ahote immediately pulled her behind him. A trap had been sprung. Edward rode forward from the trees. A smile crossed his face. This time, he said, "You have nowhere to run." But Edward had made one mistake. He believed Ahote would panic. Instead, the Apache warrior remained calm. Very calm. Because while Edward thought he had trapped his prey, Ahote had already noticed something important. The riders were standing beneath unstable rocks, high on the hillside, and the mountains were about to become his greatest ally. For the second time, Edward believed victory was within reach. For the second time, destiny was preparing to prove him wrong. The riders closed in from every direction. Edward sat confidently in his saddle. At last he believed he had won. The wounded traveler stood beside him with a satisfied grin. Grace felt her heart sink. There were too many men, not too many horses, too many guns. But Ahote remained calm. His eyes moved toward the rocky hillside above them. Then he smiled slightly. Edward noticed. "Why are you smiling?" He asked Dot. "Because you chose the wrong place," Ahote answered. Before anyone understood what he meant, he picked up a stone and threw it toward a narrow ledge above them. The stone struck a loose section of rock. Loud crack echoed through the valley. Dot, then another, and another. Suddenly dozens of rocks began tumbling down the hillside. Edward's horses panicked. Men shouted in fear. Several riders lost control, and scattered dust filled the air. The carefully planned trap collapsed into chaos. Ahote grabbed Grace's hand. Outrun Dot. They disappeared into the forest before Edward could reorganize his men. For hours they moved through narrow trails hidden beneath thick pine trees. Only after sunset did they finally stop. Both were exhausted. Grace sat beside a fallen log, trying to catch her breath. "You planned that, Dot," she said. Ahote smiled. "The mountain planned it. I simply listened." For the first time since meeting him, Grace laughed freely. The sound filled the forest. And Ahote realized how much he loved hearing it. That night they camped beside a small lake. The stars reflected. Across the still water. Everything felt peaceful. Almost normal. As they sat beside the fire, Grace looked at him. "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For giving me my life back." Ahote remained silent. "Before I met you," Grace continued, "I thought my future was over. I thought Edward had taken everything." She lowered her eyes. "Then I found you." The firelight reflected in Ahote's eyes. Slowly he reached for her hand, and this time neither pulled away. Far away in the darkness, Edward sat beside a campfire, surrounded by frustrated men. His face was filled with rage. Every plan had failed. Every trap had been broken. One of his riders finally spoke. "Maybe we should stop." Edward turned toward him. "Stop?" The man nodded. "The woman doesn't want to return, and that Apache has done nothing wrong." The words were a mistake. Edward struck the man across the face. Silence immediately followed. For the first time, several of his own men looked at him differently. Not with loyalty, not with respect, but with doubt. Edward noticed, and it frightened him. Because power only exists while people believe in it. The next morning 3 men abandoned his camp. Then 2 more left before noon. By sunset, Edward had lost nearly half his followers. His anger grew even stronger. Desperate men make dangerous decisions, and Edward was becoming desperate. The following evening, Ahote and Grace reached a hidden meadow surrounded by mountains. It was one of the most beautiful places Grace had ever seen. Wildflowers covered the ground. A small stream crossed the valley. The setting sun painted the sky gold. She stood quietly taking in the view. Then Ahote stepped beside her. "One day," he said softly, "I would like to build a life here." Grace turned toward him. Their eyes met. Neither spoke, but both understood what he truly meant. For the first time, they were no longer running from the past. They were beginning to dream about the future. Unfortunately, destiny had one final challenge waiting for them. Because Edward Blackwood had just made the most dangerous decision of his life, and very soon everyone in Red Valley would feel the consequences. Edward Blackwood returned to Red Valley a different man. The confidence he once carried was gone. The respect he once commanded was fading. People had started talking. Stories spread through the town. Some spoke about Grace's escape. Others spoke about Edward's lies. Many spoke about the Apache warrior who had repeatedly outsmarted him. For the first time in years, Edward was losing control, and he could not accept it. One evening, he gathered the few loyal men he still had. "If I lose that land, I lose everything," he said. One of the men looked at him carefully. "You already lost more than land, Edward. glared at him. The man lowered his eyes, but did not take back his words. Deep down everyone knew the truth. Edward's greatest loss was not property. It was his reputation. Meanwhile, Ahote and Grace remained in the hidden meadow for several days. They enjoyed a peace neither had known for years. They fished in the stream, walked through the wildflowers, and talked about dreams they once believed were impossible. One evening they sat together beside the water. The sunset painted the valley with shades of gold and red. Grace leaned against Ahote's shoulder. Do you ever think about destiny? She asked. Sometimes. He replied. What do you think? Ahote smiled. I think destiny brought a frightened woman into a storm. And left her in my path. Grace laughed softly. That sounds like fate. Maybe it is. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ahote looked at her. Meeting you changed my life. Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. You changed mine too. She whispered. But their happiness would soon be tested one final time. The next morning, a rider arrived in Red Valley, carrying important documents. The papers revealed the truth about Edward's scheme. Several signatures had been forged. Land records had been altered. Witnesses came forward. The town council immediately opened an investigation. News spread quickly. By sunset, nearly everyone knew what Edward had done. Panic entered his heart. For years, he had escaped consequences through money and influence. This time was different. The evidence was undeniable. That night, Edward made a desperate choice. Instead of facing justice, he fled the town. But before leaving, he decided to settle one last score. Armed and furious, he rode alone toward the mountains, toward the meadow, toward Ahote and Grace. Late the following afternoon, Ahote sensed something was wrong. The forest had become unusually quiet. Birds had stopped singing. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Someone is coming, he said. Grace immediately understood. Edward. Ahote nodded. They moved toward a rocky overlook, where they could watch the trail below. Hours later, a lone rider appeared. It was Edward. Alone. His face was pale. His eyes burned with anger. Grace looked down at him. For the first time she felt no fear, only pity. Edward stopped his horse and stared up at them. Everything I built is gone, he shouted. You destroyed me. Grace shook her head. No, you destroyed yourself. The words struck harder than any weapon. For several seconds silence filled the sheathed valley. Edward looked at Grace. Then at Ahote. Then at the mountains surrounding him. Finally he understood. He had spent years trying to own everything, and in the process he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Himself. But even then, his pride refused to surrender completely. And as the sun began to set, everyone knew the final chapter of this story was about to begin.